Shankar, before we move to the question of specifically of Ukraine and Russia and what could happen around that, do you think language on climate change could be found? Because essentially India is going to probably certainly be saying, look, we have done X amount. So has China, so have many countries in the developed world. It's not that, I mean, India is, for example, ahead of most of the other countries when it comes to what it's actually delivering. The question of climate finance, though, is it going to be possible and assistance and development to other countries which are trying to make a change? Do you think it'll be possible to get language that will satisfy everyone?
So I actually would have to disagree with the assessment of my co-panelists there on where various countries stand when it comes to climate change. And I think, Vikram, as you mentioned, I think India has been taking its commitments made in Paris quite seriously. In fact, is doing, by most independent indications, is performing closer to its commitments than most other countries. Actually, in fact, the UK is another country that is doing rather well in that respect, but most Western countries are in fact not. If you look at the investment in renewables, India is actually taking, has the fifth largest installed capacity in solar. It's, in terms of new installations, it's third after China and the US. And if you look in terms of steps that India is making towards climate financing, it's actually quite progressive in many ways. Yeah. So I think there's a very archaic notion that just because India and China oppose certain commitments with regards to the phase out of coal at the Glasgow meeting of the COP, that just because of that India has a very backward, is not making sufficient commitments. Right. And I think the record actually points quite otherwise. The fact is, I think it's not just about words at the G20 Summit. I think the real test is whether there can be actual deliverables when it comes to reforming multilateral institutions, including institutions such as the World Bank, to actually channel some of the financing, despite major commitments, they have not actually been delivered upon by the West, to helping countries in the developing world largely, who are both going to be the victims of climate change, who are going to suffer the most from it, and who have the greatest development needs, to actually go through with a development agenda that can meet climate objectives at the same time. And again, despite a lot of talk, that finance has not been forthcoming. So I think the real test will be whether India can use this presidency to channel some of the reform of multilateral institutions, get certain financing commitments, and not just leave it here at this, but actually follow up with this at the COP summit. Loss and damage, by the way, is another thing that has been resisted by the West. Follow up at the COP summit, it'll be part of the Troika at future G20 summits that will be chaired by Brazil and South Africa. That will be the real test.
All right. And Andreas Umland now joining us, analyst, Stockholm Center for East European Studies, joining us from Kiev, Ukraine. I want to turn my attention to Ukraine and Russia, because I'm sure that's going to be a large focus. But before I do that, if I could just, Ambassador Kantkar, get your sense on the sort of cleavages or the divides that we might find, which we've been noticing at the Sherpa meeting and which we might be noticing tomorrow. Look, there are certain issues on which there's the West and most other countries, in a sense, are perhaps looking at Russia and saying that, would you agree to a certain amount of language? That happens in some areas. When it comes to areas like climate change, we're just discussing, sometimes becomes the South versus the North. How is this dynamic actually playing itself out? Is it a very clear divide in most care areas, or is it sort of fluid in some sense, that you agree with these countries on X matters but don't agree on Y matters?
Well, there is no clear divide as such. There is East-West polarization, especially between China and the US-led West. There is also North-South divide, no doubt about it. But on different issues, coalitions are building. For instance, you refer to climate change. I'll entirely endorse what Dhruv said. Actually, India has done very well in terms of implementation of its NDCs, nationally determined commitments, whereas Western countries have not been able to come up with their commitments on climate finance. But there are other issues like Ukraine conflict, where we would have liked to go along with the Bali template, which was a compromise, which India also helped in drafting. Unfortunately, China and Russia has walked back from that compromise. So that has become a stumbling point now. Let's see how it's resolved. But
Right.
a whole lot of other issues where we have, going by media reports, continuing our differences, including some of the issues where China has been far from cooperative. For instance, in question of debt distress of developing countries, or millet initiative of Prime Minister, or Vasudev Kutumbakam, or lifestyle for environment. A whole lot of those issues are there. I don't know what's the present state of play. G20
Okay.
Sherpa Amitabh Kant mentioned that there is, the leaders' declaration is almost ready. I'm sure we'll have a substantive outcome document emerging out of this G20
Okay,
summit.
what exactly is there in the outcome document, obviously, is something that we're going to take a look at. Andres, if I can just...
major outcome will be AU joining as permanent member. That itself will be something, as a major deliverable of the New Delhi summit.
All right. Ambassador Kanta, I know you have to leave us now. Thank you so much for having been with us. Andres Sumlan, let me just welcome you, to this program. Looking at it from the point of view of, you're there in Ukraine right now. What practically do you think can be done at G20 to address the question of the war in Ukraine, to try and see language that could perhaps make everybody happy? Or is that something which is looking more or less impossible right now? Because China and Russia have backtracked from the position they took at Bali. That sort of language is not going to be acceptable anymore. So either you have a communique that is really wishy-washy on the question of Ukraine and the war there, or you will not have a communique at all. At least that's what many of the analysts seem to be telling us.
I think one would simply need to come back to the basic principles of the United Nations, of the international order, not of the international liberal order, but of international order in general, that borders are inviolable, that states have territorial integrity and political sovereignty. One does not even have to mention Ukraine if one puts that in there and then says that it also relates to, among other countries, Ukraine. That would be already sufficient. It would be, of course, against the interests of Russia, that does not recognize the borders and territorial integrity and political sovereignty of Ukraine. But maybe one can find a formulation that would be generic enough to at least put down again these principles. That is perhaps the best one can achieve at this point.
Dhruva Jaishankar, before you leave us, look, frankly, I think all the Sherpas, everyone's been trying for a year to find language. They've been in Manesar for the last 5 days trying to find language. I strongly doubt we'll be able to find appropriate language in the course of a television program that everyone will agree to sign up on. But something like that, is that something which you think is feasible? Or do you think maybe we should just reconcile ourselves to the fact there won't be a communique, there'll be some other sort of a statement?
No, I don't think we can say at this point. It's being, as of today, things were still in negotiation. So I'm not sure we should be premature about saying that there will be a statement or won't and what it would look like. Obviously, I think there is a question of what kind of formulation can be reached. And we did have a consensus that was reached in Bali last year, which India helped broker along with others. But obviously, there's been resistance to that. There've been changes in the ministerial meetings, and I think the question remains as to whether an acceptable formulation can be found. I sense that certainly it is within the realm of possibility, because there is a precedent for it, and all the countries participating have come in with a sort of constructive attitude. So I do think it is certainly within the realm of possibility. But again, this is supposed to capture a sense of consensus of all members of the G20. And again, because there have been resolutions passed at the UN Security Council again, involving many of these same actors, it certainly seems possible that some consensus can be reached.
All right, let me now get in Siddharth Tiwari, Senior Advisor, G20 India, Fellow at the Chatham House, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. As Dhruva was just saying, don't write off the possibility that there could actually be language that everyone signs off on. But India is in any case going to be very keen on a certain other set of issues that certainly should come up, the developmental agenda, African Union getting a seat. All of those are being very much talked about, but is that almost a fallback position in case we can't reach a final communique? Siddharth
No,
Tiwari,
absolutely not.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's absolutely not a fallback position. It is a front position, and let me explain to you why. That both the IMF, World Bank forecasts are saying that for the next 20, 30 years, the global south will provide the bulk of global growth. And so the development, the growth of the global south is front and center, not only for global south, but for advanced economies. That if the south doesn't grow, the north doesn't grow. And that is the framework, the mindset that the affairs and leaders behind to this.
All right, that's really interesting what you said. And if I could just play for our viewers what it was that Amitabh Kant had told us last week on the India story, just before he went into that Sherpa meeting. He did say what India is going to be trying to achieve at that Sherpa meeting, and seeing as we got it directly from the horse's mouth, let me just play one of that for you and then get comments from our panelists. This is what Amitabh Kant told us the effort is going to be to try and achieve.
The headline should be about growth and development of the world, because that's what India is focused on. It's about the last mile. It's about citizens. Our presidency has been very citizen-centric, and therefore the impact that it will have on the community of the world in terms of SDGs, in terms of we should not lose track of the basic growth issues, because 1/3 of the world is in recession, 75 countries are in global debt. So our presidency should be remembered for its unique contribution to both the citizens of the world, to growth of the world, which is sustainable and inclusive, and for being the voice of the global south. The Ukraine war is not our creation. It's for us being the voice of the global south, to bring all the developmental issues up front, to be, as the Prime Minister said, very human-centric in our approach, and to focus on all our key priorities has been the primary aim. And all through the year in our ministerials, we have pushed all these issues up front. We have brought them center stage.
So that was the G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant talking to us a week ago on the India story. Andrea Sumland, I'm going to get both Siddharth Tiwari and Dhruv Jaishankar to react to this, because the agenda, at least from the Indian point of view, seems to be really clear-cut. And Andreas, I understand that for Europe, Ukraine is really, really important, and getting a statement on that is really, really important. But as we just heard from the Sherpa himself, from the Indian point of view, you've got to say, for the global south, there are other issues. There are questions around development. There are questions around climate change. There are questions around multilateral agencies. There are questions around having a seat at the high table. Those are also important and deserve priority. Is that a fair position, you think, or will there be some in the West who are not completely happy with that?
Well, I would challenge this position, because in a way, for the European countries, most of which are members of NATO and the European Union, the issue of protecting borders and of political sovereignty and territorial integrity is perhaps less salient, because these countries are allied to with each other and to the United States. They are under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, and they have therefore a security guarantee that most countries in the global south do not have. They do not have such a firm alliance and big allies, and they should perhaps be actually more worried about such principles as inviolability of borders, territorial integrity, and political sovereignty. Right. A potential alliance that I see between Ukraine and India is that, as far as I understand, both Ukraine and India are unhappy with the current United Nations system. India is now the largest country of the world, but not a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and perhaps wants a reform of the United Nations. And Ukraine is unhappy with the permanent seat of the Russian Federation in the UN Security Council, which is actually not in accordance with the statutes of the UN Security Council, which mentions the Soviet
All right.
Union.
Dhruva, I'm just going to get a quick reaction from Dhruva Jaishankar before he has to leave us. Dhruva, on that specific point, I think what Andres is saying is that, look, some language around territorial integrity, that this is not a time for war, the fact that you can't just go on invading countries, or you can't just, I mean, territorial stuff, that is important for the South as well. I'm sure it's important for India. I mean, after all, we have a large neighbor trying to gobble up parts of our territory as well. So I guess there would be some focus on trying to get language around that, even if it doesn't make everyone happy.
No, I mean, look, there will be a formulation, some kind of formulation attempted on that mentions the Russia-Ukraine war. This was done again last year. It's been done in every ministerial, even though Russia and China have dissented on several occasions this year under India's presidency. But I should also emphasize that, India has, when it was a member of the UN Security Council, also emphasized sovereignty and territorial inviolability as well in its statements. So I think that there is that understanding on India's part as well.
All right, Dhruva Jaishankar, thank you so much for having joined us with that perspective. We'll try and talk to you again once we know exactly what unfolds out here. Siddharth Tiwari, let me just get you into that particular debate and discussion around, and look, let's face it, everyone knew that India is going to have a real tightrope walk this year to try and match all the various objectives, never completely easy. You were hearing what Andres was saying about that tightrope walk. You can't completely ignore the security questions, because that can affect everybody, including those who are not members of NATO. And yes, there's that developmental agenda that you were talking about and that Amitabh Kant was talking about.
So absolutely. Look, just to step back a little bit, if you look at where we are in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had one crisis after another. We had COVID, we had the cost of living crisis, the geopolitical crisis, the climate crisis, the debt crisis. Every indicator on the SDGs has receded. And in this, the challenge for the Indian presidency is that the world doesn't slip into fragmented blocks, because fragmentation will lead to lower growth. It'll be bad for global South. It'll be bad for the global North. There has been, in the midst of all this crisis, there has been one silver lining, and it's something Amitabh sort of touched briefly, and that's been the impact of digital public infrastructure on reaching the last mile, reaching every citizen in every country. And that's an area where India is leading the world, both in the design and the implementation. And in the next decade, the sources of growth will come from digitalization. And if you look at it that way, the global South is well poised to reach the last mile. And it also fights against what I would call is the land fragmentation or political fragmentation. Because technology is neither political and it has no boundaries.
Right, I think so. So obviously, Andres, let me just throw that back to you. So obviously, many interests, many issues will have to be dealt with, and it is a tightrope walk. Do you think the absence of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the leaders of China and Russia, are not there here? Is there a major signal in that? And paradoxically, does it make it easier to push this entire dialogue or a process of trying to get somewhere? Does it make it easier? Does it make sure that things are not completely overshadowed by China trying to be obstructionist or by Russia?
So
maybe
G20 is
Karen, Andres, if you could answer that, then I'll come back to you, Mr. Tiwari. Yeah, Andres Sumlan.
Yes, maybe these are two, I would say, revanchist powers who want to change borders, who want to change the current situations of their territories, and maybe in that way it may be actually good for this meeting if the heads of states of these two countries or the formal or informal leaders of these countries are not there. But of course, that it also downgrades then in a way the G20. And the suspicion what one has here is that China and Russia actually want to downgrade the G20 and want to upgrade other structures like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS group. So I think it's an ambivalent situation, but in any way, I think one should make most of it as it emerges now.
All right, that's a really interesting perspective, Andreas. Thank you for being with us.